Sometimes the things we inherit aren't meant to make sense right away. Sometimes they're meant to call us home. Noreen Tabbard was 62 years old when her grandmother died, and all she got was a cracked rock wrapped in an old quilt. She'd left that mountain town decades ago and never looked back. Now she stood on a porch, holding a stone that felt strangely warm in her hands. Minna Vale, her grandmother's oldest friend, watched from the doorway. The old woman knew something. Something about why this rock had been guarded for 50 years, why it was whispered about on a deathbed. Inside that stone was a secret that would lead Noreen to a fortune hidden in the mountains. But first, she'd have to find the courage to break it open. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive down from the Bitterroot Mountains had taken most of the morning, and Noreen's hands still ached from gripping the steering wheel. She'd lived up there for 30 years, in a homestead so remote that the mailman only came twice a week, and even then he left her parcels at the bottom of the access road. She liked it that way. The silence suited her. The mountains asked nothing of her, except that she respect them, and respect was something Noreen had always been good at giving. To land, to weather, to the solitude that had become her closest companion. But her grandmother's funeral had pulled her down from those heights, back to the flat, wind-scraped town of Prospect, Montana, where she'd been born and where she'd promised herself she'd never return. The town hadn't changed much. Main Street still stretched for 8 blocks before surrendering to open range on both sides. The grain elevator still dominated the skyline, its faded paint advertising a feed company that had gone bankrupt in the 80s. Prospect had maybe 700 people left, most of them older than Noreen, most of them hanging on because leaving required energy they no longer possessed. Noreen pulled her truck into the gravel lot beside Vale's general store, the same store that had been there since before the Second World War. The building leaned slightly to the east, as though tired of standing upright. Paint peeled from the clapboard siding in long, papery strips. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Minna Vale, Proprietor," in letters that had faded to the color of old bone. She sat in the truck for a moment, watching dust devils spin across the empty street. The funeral had been 3 days ago. Small. Quiet. Her grandmother, Opal Tabbard, had outlived most of her friends and all of her enemies. Noreen had stood beside the grave with a handful of people she barely remembered, listening to a preacher who'd never met Opal recite the same words he probably recited over every grave in this dying county. Afterwards, Minna had pressed a folded note into Noreen's hand. "Come see me before you leave," it said. "There's something Opal wanted you to have." That was 2 days ago, and Noreen had spent those days avoiding this visit, packing up her grandmother's small house on the edge of town, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated objects that meant nothing to anyone anymore. She'd found the usual things: chipped dishes, worn clothes, boxes of receipts and letters. She'd also found things that puzzled her: topographical maps with routes marked in pencil, a leather-bound ledger filled with dates and cryptic notations, books about geology and mineralogy that looked read and reread until their spines had cracked. Her grandmother had been a mystery to her, even in childhood. Opal Tabbard had been a woman of few words and many secrets, a woman who walked the mountains alone and came back with dirt under her fingernails and a distant look in her eyes. She'd raised Noreen after her parents died in a car accident when Noreen was 8. It hadn't been a warm childhood, but it had been stable. Opal had taught her things: how to read weather, how to navigate by landmarks, how to be comfortable in her own company. And then Noreen had left. She'd married young, to a man from Billings who'd promised her a different kind of life. That marriage had lasted 6 years before it collapsed under the weight of his drinking and her restlessness. After the divorce, she'd drifted for a while, working odd jobs, trying to figure out who she was when she wasn't running from something. Eventually, she'd bought the homestead in the Bitterroots with money from a small inheritance, not from Opal, but from her mother's side of the family. She'd built a life there, simple and contained, and she'd told herself she was content. She hadn't spoken to her grandmother in over a decade. There had been no falling out, no dramatic argument, just distance, just silence, just the slow, inevitable way that people let each other go. Now Opal was gone, and all that remained was a note and whatever waited inside Vale's general store. Noreen climbed out of the truck and crossed the lot. The air smelled like dust and diesel and the dry, persistent heat of late summer. Grasshoppers clicked in the yellow weeds that pushed up through the gravel. She stepped onto the porch, and the boards groaned under her weight. The door was propped open with a cinder block. Inside, the store was dim and cool, cluttered with shelves that held everything from canned goods to hardware supplies. The floor was uneven planks, worn smooth by a century of foot traffic. Somewhere in the back, a radio played low, some talk station discussing grain prices and weather forecasts. Minna Vale emerged from behind a stack of feed sacks. She was older than Opal had been, maybe 80, maybe more. She moved slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones had begun to betray them. Her face was deeply lined, tanned to leather by decades of sun and wind. Her eyes, though, were sharp and clear. "Noreen," she said. Not a question, a statement. "Minna." They stood there for a moment, taking each other's measure. Noreen hadn't seen this woman in 30 years, but Minna looked at her as though no time had passed at all. "You came," Minna said. "You asked me to?" Minna nodded. She walked to the counter and reached beneath it, producing a bundle wrapped in faded fabric. Noreen recognized it immediately, the quilt from her childhood bed, the one with the star pattern that Opal had sewn by hand. It had been soft once, but now it was stiff with age and use. "She wanted you to have this," Minna said, placing the bundle on the counter. Noreen approached slowly. The bundle was roughly the size of a cantaloupe, lumpy and irregular. Through the fabric she could feel something hard and cool. "What is it?" she asked. "Open it." Noreen unwrapped the quilt carefully. Inside was a stone, not a gemstone, not anything obviously valuable. Just a rock, round and smooth, about the size of a grapefruit. Its surface was mottled grey and tan, marked with thin cracks that spiderwebbed across its surface. It looked like something you'd find in a riverbed and skip across the water. She picked it up. It was heavier than she'd expected, and strangely warm, as though it had been sitting in the sun, even though it had been wrapped in fabric in a dark store. "This is it," Noreen said. "This is what she wanted me to have?" "That's it." Noreen turned the stone over in her hands. "It's a rock." "Yes." "Why would she—" Noreen stopped. She looked at Minna, searching the old woman's face for some hint of humour, some indication that this was a joke. But Minna's expression was serious, almost solemn. "Your grandmother spent 50 years protecting that stone," Minna said. "She told me that when the time came, I was to give it to you. She said you'd understand. I don't understand. I don't understand any of this." "You will." Noreen set the stone back on the counter. She felt a flicker of anger, the same anger she'd felt when she was young, and Opal would refuse to explain herself, would simply expect Noreen to accept things without question. Minna, I drove down here because you said Opal wanted me to have something. I thought maybe there were documents, or family photos, or I don't know. Something that mattered. This is a rock. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with a rock." Minna reached out and placed her hand over Noreen's. Her skin was papery and cool. "Your grandmother loved you," she said quietly. "She wasn't good at showing it, I know. But she loved you, and she trusted you. That stone, it's not just a rock, it's a key. And when you're ready, you'll know what door it opens." Noreen wanted to argue, wanted to tell Minna that she was speaking in riddles, that she didn't have time for mysteries or games. But something in the old woman's eyes stopped her. Minna believed what she was saying. Whatever this stone meant, whatever Opal had intended, Minna believed it mattered. "There's more," Minna said. She reached under the counter again and pulled out a worn leather book, the same ledger Noreen had seen in Opal's house. "She wanted you to have this too. Read it. It'll help you make sense of things." Noreen took the ledger. The leather was cracked and soft with age. She opened it to a random page and saw dates, coordinates, sketched diagrams of mountain terrain, her grandmother's handwriting, small and precise. "What was she doing?" Noreen asked. "Protecting something," Minna said. "Something important. Something she hoped you'd protect, too." Noreen closed the ledger. She looked down at the stone, still sitting on the counter between them, and felt that strange warmth radiating from it. For a moment, she wanted to refuse it, to tell Minna to keep it, to walk out of this store and drive back up to her homestead and forget any of this had happened. But she didn't. She wrapped the stone back in the quilt, tucked the ledger under her arm, and nodded to Minna. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Minna replied. "You've got a long road ahead of you." Noreen left the store and walked back to her truck. She placed the bundle and the ledger on the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel, staring out at the empty street. The sun was high now, bleaching the color from everything, turning the world into shades of white and grey. She'd planned to leave Prospect today, to drive back up into the mountains and put all of this behind her. But as she sat there, feeling the weight of the stone beside her, she knew she wouldn't be leaving. Not yet. Something had started, something her grandmother had set in motion years ago. And despite herself, despite the life she'd built on distance and solitude, Noreen wanted to know what it was. The motel room smelled like old carpet and cigarette smoke that no amount of air freshener could mask. Noreen sat on the edge of the bed, the stone unwrapped on the nightstand, the ledger open in her lap. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The sound of trucks on the highway drifted through the thin walls. She'd been reading for an hour, trying to make sense of her grandmother's notations. The ledger was organized by date, stretching back 30 years. Each entry included coordinates, weather conditions, and observations about terrain and geological features. There were sketches of mountains, valleys, creek beds. Some pages had mineral samples taped to them, small fragments of rock labeled with chemical compositions. It was clear her grandmother had been surveying something, mapping something. But what and why remained unclear. Noreen set the ledger aside and picked up the stone again. In the fading light, it seemed to glow faintly, that persistent warmth pulsing against her palm. She turned it slowly, examining the cracks that covered its surface. They formed a pattern almost like a web, radiating from a central point. As she studied it, something slipped from the folds of the quilt. A photograph, old and faded, its edges soft with handling. Noreen picked it up carefully. The image was sepia-toned, probably taken 50 or 60 years ago. It showed 4 women standing at what looked like a mountain pass. They were dressed in practical clothing, work pants, heavy jackets, boots. Behind them, peaks rose into a cloudless sky, and in their hands, each woman held a stone similar to the one now resting in Noreen's lap. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in her grandmother's handwriting, were coordinates and 4 names: Opal Tabbard, Minna Vale, Lenore Hastings, Virginia Dunn. Noreen stared at the names. She knew Minna, of course, but the other 2 were unfamiliar. She looked back at the image, trying to identify which woman was her grandmother. The second from the left, she thought. Younger, but with the same straight posture, the same serious expression. The photograph triggered something in Noreen's memory. Not a specific moment, but a feeling. She remembered being young, maybe 6 or 7, waking in the middle of the night to find her grandmother's bed empty. She'd gotten up and looked out the window to see Opal walking away from the house, a pack on her back, heading toward the mountains. Noreen had watched until her grandmother disappeared into the darkness. In the morning, Opal had been there, making breakfast as though nothing had happened. When Noreen asked where she'd been, Opal had simply said, "Walking." And that had been the end of it. There had been other nights like that, throughout Noreen's childhood. Nights when Opal would disappear and return by dawn, offering no explanation. Noreen had learned not to ask. But now, looking at this photograph, she understood that those walks had been more than wandering. Her grandmother had been going somewhere specific, doing something purposeful, and she hadn't been doing it alone. Noreen felt a tightness in her chest, not quite anger, but something close to it. Why hadn't Opal told her? Why all the secrecy, all the silence? The stone seemed to pulse in her hand, growing warmer. Noreen set it down quickly, startled. For a moment, she thought she'd imagined it. But when she touched it again, there was no mistaking the heat radiating from its core. She rewrapped it in the quilt and placed it back on the nightstand. Then she grabbed the ledger and the photograph and left the motel room. Minna's house was a small ranch-style building on the north edge of town, set back from the road behind a row of cottonwood trees. Noreen knocked on the door and waited. Lights were on inside. She could hear a television playing. Minna opened the door slowly, using a cane for support. She looked unsurprised to see Noreen standing there. "I figured you'd be back," she said. "I found this." Noreen held up the photograph. It was in the quilt with the stone. Minna studied the image, her expression softening. "We were young then. Younger than you are now. What were you doing up there?" "Come in," Minna said, stepping aside. "This isn't a conversation for the porch." Inside, the house was tidy and sparse. Minna led Noreen to a small living room and lowered herself into a recliner. Noreen sat on the couch, the photograph still in her hand. "The stones," Minna began, "were given to us by someone who understood their value." This was in 1967. We were all young women then, living in Prospect, trying to make a life in a place that didn't offer much. Lenore worked at the bank. Virginia ran the post office. Your grandmother and I, we did whatever work we could find. "Who gave you the stones?" "An old prospector named Tobias Reed. He'd spent 40 years in these mountains, and he'd found something, a route through the high country that nobody else knew about. It passed through areas rich in minerals. Not gold, not silver. Rare earth elements, things most people didn't understand the value of back then." Noreen leaned forward. "Why give them to you?" "Because he was dying, and he didn't want what he'd found to fall into the wrong hands. Mining companies were starting to move into the area, tearing up the land, poisoning the water. Tobias believed that some places should be protected. He gave us the stones and the knowledge to find the root. He told us to guard it, to keep it secret until the time was right. And you did. We did. For decades. We learned the route, walked it, mapped it. We made sure no one else could find it. And as we got older, as the others passed away, your grandmother took on the responsibility. She was the strongest of us, the most determined. Noreen looked down at the photograph again. Why didn't she tell me? She tried to, in her way. She taught you how to read the mountains, how to navigate. She was preparing you, even if you didn't know it. I left. Yes. And she let you go. She knew you needed to find your own way. But she always believed you'd come back when you were ready. Noreen felt something break loose inside her, a knot of old resentment and regret. I wasn't there when she died. She didn't expect you to be. Opal wasn't sentimental. She cared about the work, about the legacy, and now that work belongs to you. Noreen shook her head. I don't know anything about minerals or roots or... You know the mountains. You know how to survive in them. The rest you can learn. What's in the stone? Noreen asked. Why is it so important? Minna smiled faintly. That's for you to discover. Your grandmother believed you'd know when the time was right. Trust that, Noreen. Trust her. Noreen left Minna's house an hour later, her head spinning with information and questions. She drove back to the motel, parked, and sat in the truck for a long time, staring at nothing. Her grandmother had been part of something larger than Noreen had ever imagined. A secret passed down, a responsibility carried for decades. And now it was hers. She thought about her life in the Bitterroots, the isolation she'd chosen, the simplicity she'd craved. All of it felt suddenly small and insufficient, a retreat rather than a choice. Inside the motel room, the stone sat on the nightstand, wrapped in the old quilt. Noreen unwrapped it slowly and held it up to the light. The cracks seemed deeper now, more pronounced. She could almost see something glowing faintly inside, as though the stone were more than solid rock, as though it were a shell containing something precious. She thought about cracking it open, about seeing what lay inside, but something stopped her. Not yet, she thought. Not until she understood more. She placed the stone carefully on the bed and opened the ledger again, reading late into the night, tracing her grandmother's journey through those mountains, trying to understand what Opal had protected all those years, and what Noreen was meant to do with it now. The Prospect County Historical Society occupied a former bank building on Main Street, its limestone facade yellowed with age. Noreen pushed through the heavy door and found herself in a high-ceilinged room lined with glass display cases. The air smelled of old paper and dust. An elderly man looked up from a desk in the corner. He was thin and stooped, with a shock of white hair and glasses that magnified his eyes. "Help you?" he called out. "I'm looking for information about old mountain routes," Noreen said. "Survey maps, historical records, anything from the mid-20th century." The man stood, his joints creaking audibly. "You're Opal Tabbard's granddaughter. Word travels fast. Small town. I'm Vernon Haskell. I knew your grandmother. She used to come in here sometimes, asking the same kinds of questions you're asking now." He gestured toward a back room. "Come on. Most of what we have is in the archives." Noreen followed him through a doorway into a cluttered space filled with filing cabinets and cardboard boxes. Maps hung on the walls, some framed, others simply pinned up with tacks. Vernon pulled out a chair for her and began rifling through a cabinet. "What exactly are you looking for?" he asked. "My grandmother left me some notes about a route through the mountains. I'm trying to figure out where it goes." Vernon paused, his hand hovering over a drawer. The old route. You know about it? I know the stories. There used to be a pass that the early settlers used, back before the railroad came through. It cut through some rough country, high elevation, dangerous in winter. Eventually it was abandoned when easier routes were developed. But there were always rumors about it. What kind of rumors? Vernon pulled out a folder and set it on the table. That it passed through areas rich in minerals. Copper, mostly, but other things too. Every few decades, somebody would try to rediscover it, usually mining. Companies looking to stake claims, but the route was never properly documented, and the terrain was unforgiving. Most gave up. He opened the folder, revealing yellowed maps and survey documents. This is from a geological survey done in 1952. They were looking for mineral deposits in the high country. You can see here. He pointed to a topographical map covered in notations. They found evidence of rare earth elements in this area, but they couldn't determine how extensive the deposits were because the terrain was too difficult to access. Noreen studied the map. The coordinates matched some of the entries in her grandmother's ledger. Did they ever try to develop it? There were proposals, but by the 60s, environmental regulations were starting to tighten, and the area was deemed too sensitive. The companies moved on to easier targets. Vernon looked at her over his glasses. Why the interest now? I'm trying to understand what my grandmother was doing all those years. Protecting it, I'd imagine. Opal was fierce about these mountains. She believed some places were meant to be left alone. Noreen felt a map fragment slip from between the pages of the folder. A hand-drawn sketch on aged parchment, showing a partial route marked with specific landmarks. The handwriting was her grandmother's. Where did this come from? She asked. Vernon leaned in to look. I don't know. Must have gotten mixed in somehow. Your grandmother did donate some materials to us over the years. Noreen studied the fragment carefully. It showed a creek system, a distinctive rock formation, and what looked like a high meadow. At the bottom, Opal had written, "Second marker, east face." Can I borrow this? Noreen asked. It's yours. If Opal drew it, she'd want you to have it. Noreen spent the next hour cross-referencing the map fragment with the geological surveys, trying to pinpoint exact locations. Vernon helped, pointing out how the topography had changed over the decades due to erosion and logging. As they worked, Vernon said, "You should know, there's been some renewed interest in this area recently. Fellow named Kyle Brenner has been buying up property around the foothills. Says he's developing a resort. But I have my doubts." What kind of doubts? Brenner's from out of state, has money behind him. He's been aggressive about acquiring land, making offers people can't refuse. Some folks think he's after more than just a resort. Minerals? Vernon shrugged. Maybe. Or water rights. Or timber. Hard to say. But he's been asking questions about the old routes, same as you. Makes me nervous. Noreen felt a prickle of unease. Has he been in here? Twice. I didn't tell him much. Didn't like the way he asked. What do you mean? He wasn't interested in history. He was interested in access. Wanted to know about old trails, unmapped areas, places that wouldn't show up on modern surveys. Noreen folded the map fragment carefully and slipped it into her jacket. If he comes back, don't tell him you've seen me. Vernon nodded. Your grandmother asked me the same thing once. Said there were people who'd exploit what she was protecting. I respected her enough to keep quiet then. I'll do the same for you now. Back at the motel, Noreen spread the map fragment on the bed beside her grandmother's ledger. She compared landmarks, trying to construct a complete picture of the route. The fragment showed a section of the journey, probably 3 or 4 miles of mountain terrain. Combined with the coordinates in the ledger, she could begin to see the path her grandmother had walked. But there were gaps, sections where the route wasn't clear, where the maps contradicted each other or offered no information at all. She'd need to go up there herself to follow the path and fill in the missing pieces. The thought both excited and frightened her. She hadn't done any serious hiking in years, and this wouldn't be a casual day trip. The elevations were high, the terrain difficult. If something went wrong, she'd be alone. But that was how her grandmother had done it. Alone, year after year, walking those mountains to keep them secret. Noreen opened the ledger to a page dated 15 years earlier. Her grandmother had written, "Verified markers 3 through 7. Route intact. No evidence of intrusion." Markers. The fragment had mentioned a second marker. There must be a series of them, waypoints along the route. If she could find them, she could follow the path. She thought about what Vernon had said, about Kyle Brenner asking questions. If he was looking for the route, he might already be searching the mountains. She couldn't let him find it first. Noreen picked up the stone, still wrapped in the quilt, and felt its warmth through the fabric. Whatever was inside, whatever her grandmother had protected, it was worth the risk. She began making a list of supplies she'd need: topographical maps, a compass, camping gear, water purification tablets. Tomorrow, she'd visit Minna again, ask more questions, try to understand exactly what she was walking into. But tonight, she studied the maps until her eyes ached, memorizing landmarks and elevations, preparing herself for the journey ahead. Morning light streamed through the motel window as Noreen packed her day pack. She'd decided to make a preliminary hike into the foothills, test her endurance, and see if she could locate any of the landmarks from the map fragment. It wasn't the full route, not yet, but it was a start. She drove to Minna's store just after 9. The old woman was behind the counter, sorting through a delivery of canned goods. "I need to ask you about something," Noreen said, pulling out the map fragment. "There's a reference here to markers. What are they?" Minna set down a can of soup and looked at the fragment. "Waypoints. We placed them along the route. Stone cairns, mostly, built to look natural. If you know what you're looking for, you can spot them. If you don't, they just look like part of the landscape." "How many are there?" 7, spaced about a mile apart through the high country. They mark the safest path and the areas with the richest deposits. "Can you show me where the first one is?" Minna disappeared into the back room and returned with a wooden box, worn smooth with age. She opened it carefully, revealing an antique brass compass. The instrument was beautiful, its face etched with markings that didn't match any standard cardinal directions. "This was Tobias Reed's," Minna said. "He used it to navigate the route. The markings correspond to specific mountain peaks. If you know how to read it, you can find your way even when the trails aren't clear." Noreen picked up the compass carefully. It was heavier than modern compasses, substantial in her hand. The needle swung slowly, settling on a direction that didn't quite align with magnetic north. "It's calibrated to the route," Minna explained. "Tobias spent years mapping the peaks, understanding how they related to each other. This compass doesn't point north. It points to the next marker." "How does it work?" "You stand at a marker and sight along the compass to the next peak. The needle will guide you. Your grandmother understood it. She taught herself by walking the route dozens of times." Noreen turned the compass over. On the back, engraved in tiny letters, were coordinates, the starting point. "Can I borrow this?" "It's yours now. Everything Opal had, everything we used, it all belongs to you." Minna pulled out a folded piece of paper and spread it on the counter. It was a hand-drawn map showing the area around Prospect, with the foothills marked in detail. "The first marker is here," she said, pointing to a spot about 5 miles northeast of town. "There's an old logging road that gets you most of the way. From there, it's a 2-mile hike up to a ridge. The marker is on the east face, overlooking a creek drainage." Noreen studied the map, committing the details to memory. "Did my grandmother go up there often?" "Once or twice a year, usually in summer when the snow was gone. She'd spend a week walking the entire route, checking the markers, making sure everything was intact." "When was the last time she went?" 3 years ago. Her health was starting to fail, but she insisted, came back exhausted but satisfied." Minna's voice softened. "She knew it would be her last time. That's when she started preparing things for you, making sure the documents were in order, that the stone was ready." "Ready for what?" Minna didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "When you crack that stone open, you'll understand. But don't do it until you've walked the route. You need to see what Opal saw, understand what she was protecting. Then the stone will make sense." Noreen left the store with the compass and Minna's map. She drove northeast out of town, following a dirt road that wound through scrubland and scattered pines. The road deteriorated after a few miles, becoming little more than 2 ruts through the grass. She parked where the road ended and shouldered her pack. The hike started gently, following an old trail through stands of aspen. But after a mile, the terrain steepened, and Noreen felt her age in her knees and lungs. She paused frequently, catching her breath, reminding herself that she'd spent years living at elevation. This shouldn't be so hard. But it was. 3 decades of solitary life had made her strong in some ways, and weak in others. She pushed on. 2 hours later, she reached the ridge. The view opened up dramatically, mountains stretching to the horizon, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. Below, a creek wound through a narrow valley, its water glinting in the sun. Noreen pulled out the compass and held it level. The needle swung and settled, pointing toward a rock outcropping about 50 yards east. She hiked toward it, scanning the ground. At first, she didn't see anything, just rocks and scrub pine and patches of wild flowers. But then her eye caught something, a pile of stones, carefully stacked, weathered but clearly intentional. The marker. She approached it slowly, almost reverently. Her grandmother had built this, or at least maintained it. Opal had stood in this exact spot, looking out at this exact view, protecting this exact secret. Noreen circled the cairn, examining it from all sides. At its base, partially hidden by loose stones, she found a small metal box. She pulled it out and opened it carefully. Inside was a collection of mineral samples, each wrapped in cloth and labelled in Opal's handwriting. Noreen unwrapped one, a piece of dark grey rock shot through with veins of something metallic. The label read, "Rare Earth Elements, verified 1995. Vernon had been right. This wasn't about gold or silver. This was about something far more valuable in the modern world. Materials used in electronics, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing. Noreen returned the samples to the box and placed it back at the cairn's base. She stood there for a long time, looking out at the mountains, trying to imagine her grandmother making this journey year after year, alone, determined. As she turned to leave, she noticed fresh boot prints in the soft dirt near the cairn. They weren't hers. The tread pattern was different, the size larger. Someone else had been here recently. She felt a chill despite the warm sun. Kyle Brenner, or someone working for him. They were looking for the route, and they were getting close. Noreen hiked back down quickly, her earlier fatigue forgotten in the urgency of what she'd discovered. At the truck, she paused to catch her breath, then noticed another vehicle parked 100 yards down the old logging road. A black SUV with tinted windows. She drove past it slowly, noting the license plate. As she did, a man emerged from the tree line, tall, dressed in expensive hiking gear, carrying a GPS unit. He watched her drive by, his expression unreadable. Back in Prospect, Noreen went straight to Minna's store. "Someone's been to the first marker," she said, "and I think I just saw one of Brenner's people on the logging road." Minna's expression darkened. "Then we're running out of time." Minna locked the front door of the store and led Noreen to the back room. She moved aside a stack of boxes to reveal a built-in cabinet Noreen hadn't noticed before. From it, Minna withdrew another wooden box, larger than the one that had held the compass. "Your grandmother left this here for safekeeping," Minna said. "She didn't want it in her house where anyone might find it." Inside the box were perhaps 20 mineral samples, each carefully labeled with location coordinates, dates, and chemical compositions. Noreen picked up one after another, reading the labels. Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, yttrium. Elements she recognized from reading. Materials essential for everything from smartphones to wind turbines. "She collected these over 30 years, Minna said, each one from a different point along the route. Together, they prove the extent of the deposits. These are worth millions if extracted properly. Maybe more. The market for rare earth elements has exploded in the last decade. China controls most of the world's supply, and countries are desperate to find domestic sources." Noreen set down the sample she was holding. "That's why Brenner is interested." "Almost certainly. Someone must have leaked information about the old surveys, about what might be up there. He's been buying land strategically, positioning himself to claim mineral rights if he can find access to the deposits. But he doesn't have access. Not yet. The route crosses mostly federal land and a few private parcels. But if he can prove there are significant deposits, he can petition for mining permits. Environmental regulations are weaker than they used to be. With enough money and the right lawyers, he could make it happen." Noreen felt the weight of what she'd inherited, settling more heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about honoring her grandmother's memory. This was about preventing the destruction of an entire mountain ecosystem. "What did Opal want me to do?" she asked. "Protect it, the way she did, the way all of us did." Minna paused. "But also, use it." She knew the world was changing, that these materials would become important. She didn't want them locked away forever. She wanted them managed responsibly, with the land and the people who live here in mind. "How am I supposed to do that?" "First, you need to document the route completely. Prove that you know where it goes, what's there. Then you establish legal protection, conservation easements, mineral rights protection, whatever it takes. Your grandmother started that process years ago, but she didn't finish it. That's your job now." Noreen thought about the scale of what Minna was describing. She was one person, living alone in the mountains, with no legal expertise and limited resources. How was she supposed to go up against someone like Brenner? "I'm not qualified for this," she said. Neither was Opal when she started. But she learned, and she had help. Me, the others, people in town who understood what was at stake. You'll have help too. Noreen looked at the mineral samples again. "I need to walk the entire route, see all 7 markers, understand what's there." "Yes, and you need to do it soon, before Brenner figures out where to look." Over the next 2 days, Noreen prepared for a longer expedition. She bought camping gear at Minna's store, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, dehydrated meals. She studied topographical maps, memorizing elevations and water sources. She practiced using the antique compass, teaching herself to sight along ridgelines and identify peaks. She also began to notice things she hadn't seen before. a car that seemed to follow her when she drove to the grocery store, a man sitting in the cafe who paid too much attention when she spread maps on her table. She couldn't be sure if she was being paranoid or if Brenner really had people watching her. On the third day, she met Vernon at the Historical Society. He'd found additional documents, old mining claims from the 1950s and 60s, all of which had been abandoned when the companies couldn't find viable access routes. "There's something else," Vernon said, pulling out a folder marked Confidential. "This is from the County Records Office. Someone requested copies of all land ownership documents for the High Country last month. The request came from a law firm in Denver that represents Brenner's development company." "What does that mean?" "It means he's doing his homework. He's trying to figure out who owns what, where the boundaries are, where he might be able to claim rights." "Can he?" "It's complicated. Most of the route crosses the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, which is federal land. But there are a few private parcels mixed in, old homestead claims that were never fully resolved. If Brenner can acquire those parcels, he might be able to argue for access rights across the federal land." Noreen felt a knot forming in her stomach. "How do I stop that?" "You need to prove that the route has historical and environmental significance. Get it designated as a protected area. But that takes time and documentation, surveys, studies, legal filings. It's not something you can do quickly." "What if I don't have time?" Vernon looked at her seriously. "Then you need to find another way. Something your grandmother might have already put in place." That evening, Noreen sat in her motel room with the stone on the bed in front of her. She'd been carrying it with her everywhere, that persistent warmth, a constant presence. Now, in the quiet, she examined it more closely than she had before. The cracks weren't random, she realized. They formed a pattern radiating from a central point, like the spokes of a wheel. And at that central point, there was a small indentation, as though something had been deliberately carved there. She pressed her thumb against the indentation and felt the stone pulse, not metaphorically, but actually vibrate, like something alive. The warmth increased, spreading up her arm. Noreen set the stone down quickly. What was inside this thing? Minna had told her not to open it until she'd walked the route, until she understood what Opal had protected. But sitting here, feeling that pulse, that warmth, she wanted desperately to know. She picked up the stone again, this time with both hands. The vibration was stronger now, resonating through her palms. She could almost hear something, a low hum at the edge of perception. She thought about her grandmother carrying this stone for 50 years, never opening it, never yielding to curiosity. That kind of patience, that kind of discipline, was something Noreen had never possessed. She'd always been the one who ran, who avoided, who chose the easier path. But maybe that was why Opal had waited until now to pass this on. Maybe Noreen needed to have lived the life she'd lived, the mistakes, the solitude, the slow building of strength, before she was ready for this responsibility. She wrapped the stone carefully and placed it back in her pack. Tomorrow, she'd begin the real journey. She'd follow her grandmother's footsteps into the high country, find the markers, and understand what lay at the end of the route. And then, when she was ready, she'd open the stone and see what secret her grandmother had protected all these years. Noreen stood at the trailhead at dawn, her pack heavy with 5 days' worth of supplies. The air was cold and thin, scented with pine and the mineral smell of mountain stone. She'd told Minna her route and timeline. If she didn't call from town by Friday evening, Minna would contact Search and Rescue. The first marker was a day's hike away, back at the ridge she'd visited before. From there, the route climbed higher, following a series of ridgelines and valleys that would take her deep into the backcountry. She started walking. The trail was faint, overgrown in places where trees had fallen or erosion had changed the landscape. But the compass guided her, its needle swinging toward landmarks she was learning to recognize. By midday, she'd reached familiar territory, the ridge, the cairn, the view stretching to the horizon. She paused only long enough to eat and refill her water bottles from a nearby spring. Then she consulted the compass again. The needle pointed northwest, toward a saddle between two peaks. The afternoon was harder. The trail disappeared entirely, and Noreen had to navigate by instinct and topography, following game paths and creek beds. Her legs ached. Her pack straps dug into her shoulders, but she kept moving. As the sun began to set, she found the second marker, another cairn, this one partially hidden by a stand of twisted pines. She made camp nearby, pitching her tent on a flat shelf of rock with a view of the valley below. That night, she sat outside the tent, wrapped in her sleeping bag, and opened her grandmother's ledger by flashlight. She found an entry from 20 years earlier. Second marker verified. Creek drainage below shows no sign of disturbance. Saw elk, heard mountain lions. The land remembers what we forget. It knows its own value. Noreen closed the book and looked up at the stars. They were brilliant here, away from any light pollution. So dense they seemed to merge into a river of light flowing across the sky. She thought about Opal sitting in this same spot, looking at these same stars, feeling that same mix of exhaustion and wonder. Why had she left? Why had she spent so many years running from this place, from this woman, from the responsibility that had always been waiting for her? She remembered the argument they'd had the day she left. She'd been 24, recently divorced, desperate to start over somewhere far away. Opal had tried to tell her something, had started to explain about the route, about the stones, about what she'd been doing all those years. But Noreen hadn't wanted to hear it. She'd accused Opal of trying to trap her, of trying to force her into a life she didn't want. "You don't understand," Opal had said quietly. "This isn't a trap. It's a gift." But Noreen hadn't listened. She'd packed her belongings and driven away, and she hadn't looked back for 30 years. Now, sitting alone in the darkness, she understood what her grandmother had meant. This wasn't a burden. It was a purpose. Something larger than herself, larger than her own small life. She slept fitfully that night, dreaming of mountains and stones and women walking through snow. The next day took her higher. The fourth and fifth markers were harder to reach, separated by steep climbs and narrow passages through rock formations. By the time she found the fifth marker, perched on a knife-edge ridge with drops on both sides, she was exhausted and trembling. But the view was worth it. From here, she could see the entire route laid out below her, the path her grandmother had walked, the land she'd protected. The mountains stretched in every direction, ancient and indifferent, holding their secrets close. Noreen pulled out the stone, still wrapped in the quilt. She sat on a flat rock and held it in her lap, feeling its warmth through the fabric. The pulse was stronger here, more insistent, as though the stone recognized where it was. She thought about opening it, about seeing what was inside. But Minna's words echoed in her mind. "Don't do it until you've walked the route." She rewrapped the stone and put it away. That night, she made camp in a high meadow near the sixth marker. Fontedor air was colder here, and she could see her breath. She built a small fire. She'd seen no evidence of anyone following her, no boot prints or disturbed ground, and cooked a simple meal of rice and dried vegetables. As she ate, she noticed something she'd missed before. Near the marker, partially hidden by grass, was a flat stone with an engraving. She brushed away the dirt and read, "For those who come after, protect what matters." Beneath it were 4 sets of initials: OT, MV, LH, VD, Opal Tabbard, Minna Vale, Lenore Hastings, Virginia Dunn. The 4 women from the photograph, leaving their mark, claiming their responsibility. Noreen traced the letters with her finger. She thought about her own daughter, who she hadn't spoken to in 5 years. They'd had a falling out over something Noreen couldn't even remember now, some small disagreement that had grown into silence. If she walked away from this, if she let Brenna take the root, let it be destroyed, what would she be leaving for the next generation? What legacy would she pass on? She pulled out her phone. No signal, of course, but she typed a message anyway, saving it to send when she got back to town. "I'm sorry for the distance. There's something I need to tell you about your great-grandmother, about what she did and why it matters. When I get back, can we talk?" She stared at the message for a long time before closing the phone. The 7th day found her approaching the final marker. The terrain had grown increasingly difficult. Loose scree, narrow ledges, creek crossings swollen with snowmelt. But the compass guided her true, and late in the afternoon she crested a rise and saw it. The final cairn was larger than the others, more elaborate. It stood at the center of a natural amphitheater, a bowl-shaped valley surrounded by peaks. Below, a creek wound through alpine meadows. The rock formations glittered in the sun, shot through with metallic veins. This was it, the heart of the route, the place her grandmother had protected for 50 years. Noreen approached the cairn slowly. At its base, she found what she'd been hoping for, a metal box, larger than the others, weathered but intact. She opened it carefully. Inside were documents, mineral surveys, legal papers, correspondence with the environmental agencies, and beneath them, a letter addressed to her in Opal's handwriting. She sat down on a flat rock and began to read. "Noreen," the letter began, "if you're reading this, you've walked the route. You've seen what I've seen. You understand now why this matters." The letter explained everything, how Tobias Reed had found this place, how he'd spent his life mapping it, how he'd entrusted it to 4 young women who'd promised to protect it. How those women had kept that promise for decades, walking these mountains, documenting what was here, making sure it stayed hidden from those who would exploit it. "But hiding isn't enough," Opal had written. "The world is changing. These materials will be needed. The question isn't whether they'll be extracted, but how, and by whom, and for what purpose." The letter continued, outlining a plan Opal had been working on for years, a way to protect the land while allowing sustainable, community-controlled access to the minerals, legal structures, partnerships with environmental groups, funding mechanisms. "I couldn't finish it alone," the letter concluded, "but I always believed you'd come back. I always believed you'd understand. This is your inheritance, Noreen. Not the stone, not the maps. Your inheritance is the choice, to protect what matters, to do it better than we did, to make sure what we leave behind is worth inheriting." Noreen folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box. She looked out at the valley, at the mountains, at everything her grandmother had loved and protected. Then she reached into her pack and pulled out the stone. It was time. Noreen held the stone in both hands, feeling its warmth, that persistent pulse that had followed her for days. She'd walked the route. She'd seen the markers. She'd read her grandmother's letter. Now she needed to know what secret had been kept for 50 years. She found a flat rock and set the stone on it. Using another rock as a hammer, she struck the surface carefully, following one of the cracks. The first blow did nothing. The second made a small chip. The third opened a fracture, and suddenly the stone split cleanly in half. Inside was a geode, a hollow cavity lined with crystals that caught the afternoon light and scattered it in every direction. The crystals were unlike anything Noreen had seen before, geometric and perfect, ranging in color from deep blue to brilliant green. But there was more. Nested among the crystals was a rolled piece of paper, protected from moisture by a waterproof container. Noreen extracted it carefully and unrolled it. It was a deed. A legal document, dated 1968, transferring ownership of specific parcels of mountain land from Tobias Reed to a trust established in the names of the 4 women, Opal Tabbard, Minna Vale, Lenore Hastings, and Virginia Dunn. Noreen read it twice, then a third time, not quite believing what she was seeing. The parcels described in the deed corresponded exactly to the route she'd just walked. 7 separate properties, strategically placed to control access through the mountains. Together, they amounted to nearly 2,000 acres. Her grandmother hadn't just been protecting the route, she'd owned it. And now, according to the succession documents attached to the deed, Noreen owned it. She sat back, stunned. This changed everything. She wasn't just a guardian carrying on her grandmother's work. She was the legal owner of the most mineral-rich land in the county, possibly in the entire state. Attached to the deed was another letter from Opal, this one shorter. "The land is yours now. Tobias gave it to us because he trusted us to protect it. We've maintained the ownership quietly, paying taxes through the trust, keeping it out of public records as much as possible. Most people don't know these parcels exist. We wanted it that way. Easier to protect something that no one knows you have. But secrecy has its limits. At some point, you'll need to make the ownership public. When you do, be prepared. There will be people who want what you have, who'll try to take it through legal means or otherwise. But the deed is legitimate, filed and recorded. You have rights. Use them wisely. Use them well. And remember, ownership isn't just power, it's responsibility." Noreen looked at the crystals again, understanding now why the stone had been so carefully protected. It wasn't just symbolic. It was literal proof of the land's value, a sample of what lay beneath the surface. She packed everything carefully, the crystals, the deed, the letters, and began the journey back down the mountain. Her mind was racing. Brenner's attempts to buy property suddenly made sense. He must have found some reference to the old parcels in county records, must have realized there were gaps in land ownership that he could exploit. But he didn't know about the trust. He didn't know that someone already owned what he was trying to claim. The hike back took 3 days. Noreen moved faster now, driven by urgency. She needed to get the deed to Vernon, needed to understand her legal standing, needed to figure out how to protect what she'd inherited. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she emerged from the mountains and drove straight to Prospect. But instead of going to Vernon or Minna, she went first to the county courthouse. The records office was in the basement, a windowless room staffed by a bored clerk who looked up from her computer when Noreen entered. "I need to see property records for these parcels," Noreen said, handing over a list of the property descriptions from the deed. The clerk typed for a moment, then frowned. "These aren't coming up in the system." "They should be there. They've been held in trust since 1968. More typing, more frowning. "I'm seeing some records from that time period, but they're marked as archived, not in the active database." "Can you pull the archived records?" "It'll take a few days. They're in physical storage. I need them now." The clerk looked annoyed but stood up. Wait here." She disappeared into a back room. Noreen waited, tension building in her chest. After 20 minutes, the clerk returned with a dusty file box. "Found them. But there's a notation here that someone else requested these records last month." "Who?" The clerk checked the log. "Law firm from Denver. Morrison and Associates." Brenner's lawyers. Noreen's hands shook as she opened the box. Inside were the original trust documents, property surveys, tax payment records going back 50 years. Everything was in order. Everything was legitimate. But there was also a recent addition, a letter dated 3 weeks ago from Morrison and Associates to the county assessor, challenging the validity of the trust. They argued that the parcels had been improperly transferred, that Tobias Reed hadn't had clear title when he deeded them, that the current ownership was in question. "This is a legal challenge," Noreen said. "When was this filed?" "According to the date stamp, 18 days ago. But I don't see any response from the trust." Because there was no one to respond. The other women were dead. Opal had died before she could answer, and Noreen hadn't known any of this existed. "I need copies of everything," Noreen said. "And I need to know if there's been any court action on this challenge." The clerk made copies while Noreen called Vernon from the hallway. He answered on the third ring. "We have a problem," Noreen said. "Brenner's lawyers are challenging the land trust. They're saying the ownership isn't valid." "How do you know?" "I'm at the courthouse. I found the original deed. Opal left it for me. But there's a legal challenge filed 3 weeks ago." Vernon was quiet for a moment. "Where are you?" "I'm coming to you." They met in the courthouse parking lot. Noreen showed Vernon the deed, the letters, the crystals. She watched his expression change from curiosity to shock to something like awe. "Your grandmother owned the root," he said quietly. "All this time, she owned it. And now Brenner's lawyers are trying to take it. They can't. Not if the deed is legitimate." "Let me look at these documents." Vernon spread everything on the hood of his truck, reading carefully. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. "The deed is solid," he said finally. "Properly executed, properly filed. The trust is legitimate, but—" He paused. "There's a complication. Brenner's lawyers are arguing that Tobias Reed didn't have clear title to the land when he transferred it. They're saying he filed a mining claim, not a property deed, and that mining claims don't convey ownership in the same way. Is that true? It's complicated. The laws around mining claims and property ownership in the 1960s were murky. Reed might have thought he was transferring ownership when he was actually only transferring mineral rights. If that's the case, the surface land could still be federal property, and Brenner could petition for access. Noreen felt her hope sinking. So the deed might not be valid? It might not be. We'd need to trace Reed's original claim, prove he had full ownership. That's going to take time and legal expertise we don't have. Then what do I do? Vernon looked at her seriously. You fight. You hire a lawyer. You contest the challenge. You prove your case. But you need to understand. Brenner has money and resources. This could drag on for years. I don't have years. Then we find another way. Vernon gathered the documents carefully. Come with me. There's someone we need to talk to. Vernon drove them to a small office building on the edge of Prospect. The sign outside read, Whitfield Legal Services. He knocked on the door, and a woman in her 50s answered, still dressed in work clothes despite the late hour. Vernon, she said warmly, what brings you here? We need your help, Julie. This is Noreen Tabbard, Opal's granddaughter. Julie Whitfield's expression shifted to one of recognition. I heard about Opal. I'm sorry for your loss. Come in. Inside, the office was cluttered but organized, walls lined with legal books and filing cabinets. Julie gestured them to chairs and poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been sitting for hours. "Tell me what's going on," she said. Noreen explained everything: the stone, the root, the markers, the deed. Julie listened without interrupting, making notes on a legal pad. When Noreen finished, Julie sat back and studied the deed under her desk lamp. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "If this is legitimate, you own some of the most valuable land in Montana. But Vernon's right. There are complications. Can we fight the challenge? We can try. But we need to establish chain of title going back to Reed's original claim. That means digging through BLM records, historical surveys, possibly even congressional records if his claim was part of a broader homesteading program. How long will that take? Months, maybe longer, and there's no guarantee we'll find what we need." Noreen felt frustration rising. There has to be another way. Julie tapped her pen against the desk. There might be. If we can demonstrate that the land has significant historical or environmental value, we could petition for federal protection, register it as a historical landmark, or establish a conservation easement. That wouldn't resolve the ownership question, but it would prevent development while the legal issues are sorted out. How do we do that? We need documentation, surveys proving the mineral deposits, historical evidence of the root's significance, environmental studies showing the ecosystem's fragility. And we need to move fast before Brenner can establish any competing claims. Vernon leaned forward. The Historical Society has some of that documentation, and Opal's ledgers contain 50 years of observations. That's got to count for something. It's a start, Julie said, but we need more. Official surveys, ideally from a certified geologist, recent documentation showing current conditions. Noreen thought about the samples she'd collected, the coordinates she'd documented. I can go back up. I can collect more samples, take photographs, document everything systematically. That would help, but we also need expert verification, someone with credentials who can testify to the deposit's significance. Julie pulled out her phone and scrolled through contacts. I know a geologist in Missoula who does environmental consulting. Used to work for the USGS. If I can get him up here. How much will this cost? Noreen interrupted. She had some savings, but not enough for extensive legal fees. Julie looked at her steadily. Your grandmother was a friend. She helped my family years ago when we were going through a hard time. I'll do this at cost, and I'll talk to the geologist, see if he'll do the survey work as a favor. Why would he do that? Because protecting land like this matters, and because people like Brenner have been exploiting places like this for too long. There are those of us who are tired of watching it happen. Over the next 3 days, Noreen worked with Vernon and Julie to build their case. Vernon compiled historical documentation, old maps, settler journals, mining records. Julie drafted legal briefs and filed preliminary motions to delay Brenner's challenge. Noreen organized the samples from her grandmother's collection and prepared to guide the geologist on a survey expedition. The geologist, a weathered man named Tom Chen who'd spent 40 years studying mountain geology, arrived on the 4th day. He examined the samples, reviewed the coordinates, and agreed to make the trip. This is significant, he said, turning one of the crystals over in his hand. If the deposits are as extensive as these samples suggest, we're talking about a major find. But we need to document it properly, with GPS coordinates, photographic evidence, and certified samples. How long will the survey take? Noreen asked. A week, maybe more. The route you've described covers a lot of ground. We don't have a week. Brenner's lawyers could file additional motions any day. We need to move now. Tom looked at her appraisingly. "Can you keep up? The terrain you're describing isn't easy." "I just walked it. I can do it again." They prepared quickly. Tom had his own equipment: survey tools, sample containers, cameras. Noreen supplied the route knowledge and the antique compass that still worked better than any GPS in the unpredictable terrain. The night before they left, Noreen sat in her motel room organizing her pack. There was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Minna standing there, leaning on her cane. "I heard what you're planning," Minna said. "I came to give you this." She held out a small leather pouch. Inside was a surveyor's transit, an antique instrument, brass and glass, surprisingly well preserved. "This was Opal's," Minna said. "She used it to map the route precisely, to establish the legal boundaries of the parcels. If you're going to document everything officially, you'll need this." Noreen took the transit carefully. "Did she teach you how to use it?" "She taught all of us. We all learned to survey, to map, to document. We knew that someday the secrecy wouldn't be enough, that we'd need legal proof of what we'd protected. I wish she'd told me this before. I wish we'd had time to—" "She told you what she could when you were ready to hear it. That's all any of us can do." Minna embraced her briefly, then stepped back. "Be careful up there. Brenner knows you're on to something. He has people watching the trailheads. I'll be careful." After Minna left, Noreen examined the transit. It was similar to modern surveying instruments, but more delicate, calibrated for the kind of precise measurements needed to establish legal boundaries. She practiced using it, sighting along the level, checking the bubble, learning how to record elevations and angles. She thought about her grandmother using this same instrument, standing on those same ridges, documenting the route with scientific precision. Opal hadn't just been protecting the land. She'd been preparing for this moment, for the inevitable time when protection would require more than secrecy. Noreen pulled out her phone and checked her messages. Her daughter had responded, "Mum, I'd like that. I'm glad you reached out. Call me when you get back. We have a lot to talk about." Simple words, but they meant everything. Noreen typed a quick response. "I will. I love you. And I'm sorry for the lost time." She sent the message and turned off the phone to save battery. That night, she dreamed of mountains again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Her grandmother walked beside her, pointing out landmarks, teaching her to read the land. Behind them came the other women, Minna, Lenore, Virginia, all of them walking in a line, all of them protecting what mattered. In the dream, Opal turned to her and said, "You're ready now. You understand." And Noreen woke, knowing it was true. Morning came cold and clear. Tom Chen arrived at dawn, his truck loaded with equipment. They drove to the trailhead in silence, both of them focused on the work ahead. As they shouldered their packs, Tom said, "One thing you should know. I got a call last night from Morrison and Associates. They offered me a consulting contract to survey this land for them. Substantial money, more than I'd make in a year." Noreen felt her stomach drop. "Are you going to take it?" "Already turned them down, told them I was booked for the next 6 months. He looked at her seriously. "But it means they know we're doing this. They're going to try to stop us or discredit whatever we find." "Let them try." They started up the trail as the sun broke over the mountains. Behind them, in a parking area half a mile away, a black SUV sat with its engine running, its occupants watching through binoculars. The race had begun. For 5 days, they worked from dawn to dusk. Tom surveyed each marker location, documenting elevations and boundaries with the precision of a craftsman. Noreen used her grandmother's transit to verify the measurements, cross-referencing with the original maps. They collected samples from each site, photographed every significant feature, and recorded detailed notes about the geology and ecosystem. Tom was impressed. "These deposits are even richer than the samples," suggested. "The rare earth concentrations are extraordinary, commercially viable, but also complex enough that extraction would require careful environmental management." "Can we prove that?" "Already have. These samples and surveys will hold up in any court. This land is valuable, but it's also fragile. Develop it wrong, and you'd destroy not just the ecosystem, but the economic value too." On the 6th day, as they approached the final marker, they saw footprints in the dirt, fresh, less than a day old. Someone had been here recently. Tom knelt to examine them. "These aren't hikers. Wrong kind of boots. Survey crew maybe, or security." Noreen felt adrenaline spike. "Brenner's people." "Probably. Question is, are they still here?" They proceeded cautiously, scanning the ridgeline. At the final cairn, they found evidence of recent disturbance. Stones moved, dirt excavated, sample holes drilled into the rock face. "They're collecting their own samples," Tom said. "Building their own case." "Can they do that?" "If they can claim the land is federal property, they can petition for sampling rights. It's aggressive, but not necessarily illegal." Noreen felt anger rising. This was her land, her grandmother's legacy, and Brenner was treating it like his personal property. They completed their survey quickly, documenting everything, then began the hike back down. As they descended, Noreen noticed movement on a distant ridge. Figures moving, watching. They were being tracked. They reached the lower elevations as storm clouds gathered. The air pressure dropped, and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Tom moved quickly despite the weight of his pack, motivated by the approaching weather and the knowledge that they weren't alone in the mountains. "We need to get off this ridge," he said, checking the sky. "Storm's going to hit hard." But as they rounded a bend, 3 men blocked the trail. They weren't dressed like hikers. They wore tactical clothing, carried radios, and one had a camera with a telephoto lens. "Afternoon," the lead man said. He was in his 40s, military bearing, confident. "You folks need to turn around. This area is closed for survey work." Noreen stepped forward. "This is public land. You can't close it." "We have a permit from the Forest Service for geological assessment. That gives us exclusive access to this section for the duration of the survey." "Show me the permit." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't have it on me, but you can verify it with the ranger station when you get back to town." Tom spoke up. "I'm a certified geologist conducting an environmental survey. I wasn't notified of any access restrictions. Maybe your information is out of date." Noreen felt the situation escalating. These men weren't here to discuss permits. They were here to intimidate, to establish presence, to make clear that Brenner wasn't going to let this land go without a fight. "We're leaving," she said. "But this isn't over." "No," the man agreed. "It's not." They walked past the men, tension thick in the air. Noreen could feel eyes on her back, could sense the threat implicit in the encounter. Once they were out of earshot, Tom said quietly, "That was a bluff. There's no permit. If there was, I'd have heard about it through professional channels." "So what were they doing?" "Same thing we were. Collecting samples, documenting the route. Brenner's building his own case, trying to establish prior use or some other legal justification for claiming rights." The storm hit as they reached the lower trail. Rain came in sheets, turning the path to mud. Lightning flashed overhead, and thunder rolled through the valleys. They pushed on, soaked and cold, until they reached the parking area. Tom's truck was there, but it had been vandalized. The tires were slashed, the windows smashed. The equipment they'd left locked inside was gone. "Son of a—" Tom pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. Noreen looked at her truck, 50 yards away. It appeared untouched. "Come on, we'll take mine." They loaded the essential gear, the samples, the surveys, the documentation they'd collected, into Noreen's truck and drove back to Prospect through the storm. The roads were slick and visibility was poor, but Noreen pushed hard, wanting to get the samples to safety. At Julie's office, they found the lawyer waiting. She looked grim. "There's been a development," she said. "Brenner's lawyers filed an injunction this afternoon. They're claiming you're trespassing on land, subject to their client's pending claims. Judge issued a temporary order restricting access to the survey area until the ownership dispute is resolved." "They can't do that," Noreen said. "I have the deed. And they're challenging the deed's validity. Until that's resolved, the judge is playing it safe. No one goes up there without court approval. We just came from there. We have everything we need." Julie's expression shifted. "You completed the survey." Tom set his pack on the desk and began pulling out sample containers. Full documentation, 7 sites, GPS coordinates, certified samples, photographic evidence, everything needed to establish the land's geological and environmental significance. Julie looked at the samples with something like reverence. "This is it. This is what we need." "There's more," Noreen said. She pulled out the transit and the field notes she'd made using her grandmother's techniques. "I documented the legal boundaries of the parcels using the original survey methods. If we can match these to the deed descriptions, we can prove the trust's ownership predates any claims Brenner might make." Julie spread everything on her desk, examining each piece of evidence. "We need to file this immediately, before Brenner's lawyers can file any additional motions. Tom, can you write up a formal report tonight?" "Already started it, in my head. Give me a few hours. I'll draft the legal brief. Noreen, you should go to Minna's store. Vernon's been trying to reach you. Said he found something in the historical archives." Noreen drove through the storm to Minna's store. The lights were on, and through the window she could see Vernon and Minna poring over documents spread across the counter. She pushed through the door, water dripping from her jacket. "We found it," Vernon said, looking up. His eyes were bright with excitement. "We found proof of Reed's original ownership, and you're not going to believe where it was." Vernon spread a document on the counter, old, fragile, protected in a plastic sleeve. It was a land patent, dated 1892, signed by a territorial governor, granting ownership of several thousand acres in the high country to a man named Josiah Reed. "Tobias Reed's grandfather," Vernon explained. "The land was granted as payment for surveying work Josiah did for the territorial government. It wasn't a mining claim. It was a full ownership transfer. Surface rights, mineral rights, water rights, everything." Noreen studied the document. "How did you find this?" "It was misfiled in the state archives, catalogued under territorial surveys instead of land grants. I've been going through boxes for 3 days. Almost missed it." Minna pointed to a notation on the document. "Look here. The property descriptions match the parcels in your grandmother's deed. This proves that when Tobias Reed transferred the land to the trust, he had clear title. There's no question of validity." "Brenner's lawyers claimed Reed only had a mining claim," Noreen said. "They were wrong, or they were lying, hoping we couldn't prove otherwise." Vernon's voice was hard. "Either way, this changes everything. With this document and Tom's survey, we have an unassailable case." Lightning flashed outside, followed immediately by thunder that rattled the windows. The storm was directly overhead now, turning the street into a river. Noreen felt something release in her chest. Relief, vindication, the weight of uncertainty finally lifting. "We need to get this to Julie." "Already made copies," Vernon said. but the original needs to stay in the Historical Society's climate-controlled storage. It's too valuable to risk. Minna reached across the counter and took Noreen's hand. Your grandmother would be proud. You've done what she hoped you'd do. I couldn't have done it without help. None of us could have. That's the point. This was never about one person protecting something alone. It's always been about community, about people choosing to care about what matters. They locked up the store and drove together to Julie's office. The lawyer was still there, working by lamplight, surrounded by papers and legal books. When they showed her the land patent, she actually laughed, a sound of pure relief. This is perfect. With this and Tom's survey report, we can file a motion to dismiss Brenner's challenge entirely. We can also petition for immediate injunctive relief, blocking any development activity until the case is formally resolved. How long will that take? Noreen asked. Days, not weeks. This is straightforward now. We have clear title, documented environmental significance, and proof that Brenner's claims are baseless. No judge is going to rule in his favor. Tom finished his report around midnight. It was thorough and devastating. 40 pages of technical analysis proving that the deposits were both valuable and fragile, that extraction would require careful management, and that the land qualified for federal environmental protection. Julie incorporated it into her legal filing, working through the night to prepare the documents. At dawn, she drove to the county courthouse and filed everything in person, hand-delivering copies to Brenner's lawyers. The response came within hours. Brenner's legal team requested an emergency hearing. They argued that Noreen's survey was conducted illegally, that the samples were obtained without proper permits, that the land patent was irrelevant because it predated modern property law. The judge scheduled the hearing for the next afternoon. Julie spent the morning preparing. She coached Noreen on testimony, reviewed questions and answers, made sure every document was organized and readily accessible. They're going to attack your credibility, Julie warned. They'll say you have a financial interest, that your survey was biased, that you're not qualified to make judgments about environmental significance. But Tom is qualified. Yes, and he'll testify. But you need to be prepared for them to be aggressive. The hearing was held in a small courtroom in the county courthouse. Brenner was there in person, a tall man in an expensive suit, grey-haired and commanding. His lawyers flanked him, 4 of them, each with bulging briefcases. On Noreen's side sat Julie, Tom, Vernon, and Minna, small-town representation against corporate power. The judge entered, an older woman named Harriet Stone, who'd served on the bench for 20 years. She had a reputation for fairness and for impatience with legal theatrics. "Let's keep this brief," she said. "I've reviewed the filings. Mr. Morrison, you're challenging the validity of a land trust established in 1968. Ms. Whitfield, you're defending that trust and requesting injunctive relief against your opponent's client. Is that accurate?" Both lawyers confirmed. "Then let's hear your arguments." Brenner's lead attorney stood. He was smooth and confident, speaking in the polished tones of someone who'd argued hundreds of cases. "Your Honor, this case hinges on whether Tobias Reed had clear title to transfer in 1968. We contend he did not. We've presented evidence that Reed filed only a mining claim, not a land patent, and therefore—" "Stop," Judge Stone said. She picked up the land patent Vernon had found. "Is this not a land patent dated 1892, granting full ownership to Josiah Reed?" The attorney hesitated. "It is, but—" "And is Tobias Reed not the direct descendant and heir to that property?" "The chain of title is unclear. It's perfectly clear. I have 3 generations of transfer documents right here." She looked at him sternly. "Did you not find these documents in your research?" The attorney's confidence faltered. We were not aware of that particular patent. You're challenging a land transfer without fully researching the title history. That's sloppy work, Counselor. Brenner leaned forward and whispered to his attorney, who nodded and said, Your Honor, regardless of the title question, we believe the trust itself was improperly maintained. Tax payments were sporadic. Administrative requirements weren't met. Judge Stone held up tax records. Payments made every year for 56 years. Documentation filed with the State Trust Registry. Everything in order. She set down the papers and looked at both sides. Here's my ruling. Judge Stone removed her glasses and looked directly at Brenner's legal team. The land trust established by Opal Tabbard and her associates is valid. The title is clear. The administrative requirements have been met. Mr. Brenner, your challenge is dismissed. She turned to Julie. As for your petition for injunctive relief, I'm granting it. No development activity will be permitted on the disputed parcels pending further environmental review. Additionally, I'm referring this matter to the State Attorney General's office for investigation into whether Mr. Brenner's sampling activities on federal land were properly permitted. Brenner stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is my ruling, Mr. Brenner. If you wish to appeal, you're welcome to do so. But I suspect you'll find the appellate court equally unimpressed with your case. She gathered her papers. We're adjourned. Outside the courthouse, Noreen stood in the afternoon sun, feeling as though she'd just surfaced from deep water. Vernon clapped her on the shoulder. Tom shook her hand. Minna embraced her with surprising strength. It's over, Julie said. He could appeal, but he won't. He knows he doesn't have a case. What happens now? Noreen asked. Now you decide what to do with your inheritance. You own the land. You control access. The question is, what kind of steward do you want to be? Over the following weeks, Noreen worked with Julie and a team of environmental lawyers to establish a conservation trust. The land would be protected from development, but the trust would allow limited, sustainable extraction of minerals through partnerships with companies committed to environmental responsibility. Revenue from those partnerships would fund conservation efforts, support the local community, and provide scholarships for young people interested in environmental science. It was the vision her grandmother had outlined in that final letter: protection with purpose, preservation with benefit. The story made regional news. Local woman protects mountain heritage, read one headline. Reporters came to interview her, and Noreen found herself explaining her grandmother's work, the decades of quiet stewardship that had preserved something irreplaceable. One afternoon, a car pulled up to Minna's store. A young woman got out, tall and dark-haired, with Noreen's eyes and her grandmother's determined jaw. Noreen's daughter, Emily. They stood looking at each other for a moment, 5 years of silence hanging between them. Then Emily said, I got your message. Actually, I got about 10 messages. I figured I should come see what all the fuss was about. Noreen felt tears threatening. I'm glad you came. So am I. Tell me about great-grandma Opal. Tell me what she did. They walked the foothills together, and Noreen told her everything about the stones, the route, the women who'd protected it. She showed Emily the compass, the transit, the maps. She explained about rare earth elements and why they mattered, about environmental responsibility and legacy. Emily listened quietly, asking occasional questions. At one point, she said, Why didn't you ever tell me about this before? I didn't know. I spent 30 years running from it, from her, from all of this. I thought solitude was enough, that I didn't need. Noreen paused. I was wrong. About a lot of things, including about staying away from you. I wasn't exactly easy to get along with either. You were dealing with your own life. I should have been there. They sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "What happens next?" Emily asked. "With the land, I mean." "I make sure it's protected. I work with the trust to manage it responsibly. I walk the route once a year, the way Opal did, to make sure everything's intact." "Can I come with you?" Noreen looked at her daughter in surprise. "You'd want to?" "I'd like to understand what great-grandma was protecting, and I'd like to spend time with you, learn what she taught you. It's not easy terrain. The route takes a week, high elevation, challenging. I'm tougher than I look. I get that from you." Noreen smiled. "And from your great-grandmother?" They made plans for the following summer. Emily would come back, and Noreen would teach her the route, show her the markers, help her understand the responsibility they'd inherited. That evening, Noreen drove up to her homestead in the Bitterroots. She'd been away for weeks, and the cabin needed attention. But before she dealt with practical matters, she walked to a small clearing overlooking the valley. She'd brought the crystalline core from the stone, the geode that had hidden the deed. She placed it on a flat rock in the clearing, where it caught the last light of day and scattered it in brilliant colors. This had been her grandmother's secret, the thing she'd protected for 50 years. Not just land or minerals or legal documents, a trust, a belief that some things were worth preserving, that responsibility passed from one generation to the next, that the choices we make echo forward into a future we'll never see. Noreen thought about Emily learning the route, about the possibility of her daughter understanding what Opal had understood. She thought about the trust that would protect the land long after she was gone, about the community that had rallied to help her, about the second chance she'd been given. She picked up the geode and carried it inside. She placed it on a shelf where morning light would catch it, where it would remind her daily of what she'd inherited and what she'd chosen to protect. Outside, the mountains stood silent and eternal, holding their secrets, waiting for the next person who would care enough to walk their heights and understand their worth. Noreen sat by the window, watching darkness settle over the valleys, and felt something she hadn't felt in decades. She felt at peace. She felt at home. She felt, finally, that she was exactly where she belonged.